What's interesting, of course, is that all of this is documented here in New Mexico
Yes.
as well.
And then back to textiles. So when the, well, we're gradually abandoning the term Anasazi because it's offensive, and we don't need to be offensive to anybody. We'd probably be unhappy if we were called by some German name. In fact, there are all kinds of names for Anglo-Saxon people that we find offensive, and we would prefer to be called something else. So the term that is now being introduced is ancestral Puebloan, because it recognizes that the people who are the ancestors of Pueblo people who live today were simply that, ancestral Puebloan. So Anasazi is not the word to use anymore, and ancestral Puebloan is the one that we do try to use. So after a basket maker became fully, after those people became fully agricultural, really dependent on farming, and pottery really took off as the container of choice over baskets and over leather bags. You have the fluorescence then of all of these farming sites that have distinctive and easily recognizable archaeological remains. They start out with pit structures, which are houses that are built in partly into the ground. You dig a big hole, and then you put 4 posts in that hole to support a roof framework. On the surface of the ground outside that hole, you pile up brush and sticks against that 4-poster structure, and then you roof it over with other plant material. You have an opening in the middle of that for a ladder to take you down into this pit structure.
Fireplace,
And a
smoke
fireplace,
to escape.
smoke goes up there. You, in later times, have a ventilator that is dug just outside the wall, down and into the subterranean part of the structure that allows air to come in, so it feeds the fire. It doesn't suck cold air in from your roofway, but then in from outside, and there's a deflector in front of it to deflect the air.
That's smart.
People are smart, they've always been smart. And so then you find these remains in archaeological sites that are very easy to identify. And people lived in pit structures for several hundred years. For some reason we don't understand at all, truly. People decided to move upstairs and live on the surface of the ground and build what we would recognize today as pueblos, surface dwellings, where you have a doorway to walk in, or you have a ladder to go up and then enter through the roof if you're in a defensive situation, but nonetheless the whole structure is above ground. And that's what you'll see at any pueblo you go to visit today. But interestingly, the pit structure has been retained in all modern pueblos as a ceremonial structure. It's commonly called a kiva, but it does speak to and relating then to creation stories that commonly have people coming
Religious
out
overtones.
of creation stories that commonly have people coming out of the ground. And so it's a way of continuing to illustrate.
American cultures believe that they originated here, evolved here, or created here by
the Creator put them here.
Spirit here in place.
Our own creation story typically has us coming from the Garden of Eden, but nonetheless the Creator puts people somewhere
Somewhere to start.
and these stories can have one or more acts of creation. Many stories say this is the 4th act of creation. That's pretty common in the New World entirely, I mean North and South America. The details vary, but the basic story is the same. The Creator puts whichever group has this as their story in wherever they are, or the Creator put them somewhere and then they moved somewhere else. And that's why they've ended up today where they are. These are pretty common
Why
stories.
were places like Chaco put or built where they are? Others are built into cliffs and it's really hard to get to. And, I mean, it's not an easy way to live.
There are a lot of theories on this. Again, Guy archaeologists tend to talk about defensibility and warfare. And there's thoughts that the cliff dwellings were put where they were as a defensive measure. At the same time, there's not a lot of evidence that there were warrior people living someplace else that came over here to try and kill these people off. So the warfare thing is kind of hard to investigate, much less prove. There is evidence of warfare at other kinds of sites, and not the cliff dwellings, but the regular pueblo sites. Sometimes you'll find evidences of massacres, people who have been burnt in, you find burned human remains inside kivas or inside pueblo rooms. And so there is evidence of warfare, but it's typically, in my way of reading things, not at a site that somebody else would have previously said, that's a defensive site. It was built in order to prevent warfare.
You go to war, one would think, to acquire things,
Mm-hmm.
or because you're angry at
Mm-hmm.
something that was done.
Mm-hmm. And
Is
it's
there
not,
any way to tell these apart?
not that I'm aware of.
Sure.
But there are stories of internecine conflict, localized war, if you will, within a given group. There is historical knowledge about this among the Hopi Pueblos in northeastern Arizona. In the 20th century or late 19th century, there was a war from one group of people to another. I believe it was over accusations of witchcraft. And the villages split, but there were a lot of deaths in the meantime. And so one can suggest that in the past that could also have happened. But the evidence of the reasons for death are pretty hard to ferret out.
In an organized way, it's a problem, because if you get a group of people to attack another group of people, that
Mhm.
takes somebody organizing
Well,
it and planning it out.
well, and certainly that happened with the Pueblo Revolt of 1680,
Yes.
when they threw the Spaniards out of the entire state of New Mexico.
Right.
And but because the reason for war was driven out, the preparations or the readiness stance of the Pueblos against the Spanish returning was abandoned fairly early on, and the Spanish were able to come back 12 years later and reconquer New Mexico. So it's warfare among Native American groups is a topic of study. It's just archaeologically it's pretty difficult to investigate. The tools of war are pretty common on both sides of a conflict. The arrowheads are going to look the same. The pottery is going to look the same. The people are going to share a lot of characteristics, and certainly the evidence is pretty much the same,
Mhm.
destruction and fire. It's hard to say where people came from so that you could go to that place and then investigate why they went to war. We don't know who the other party was. And in fact, these archaeological sites with this evidence are old enough that we cannot, in many cases, say who their descendants even are, so that we could say, okay, well, this is ancestral.
Connection to somebody else.
You're right. This is ancestral Zia or ancestral whoever,
Mhm.
and investigate their traditional enemies. Then to say, well, okay, let's look over here and see if that's the place they came from in order to pitch this battle. There's too much missing for this to be an easy avenue of investigation.
But for some reason in 1200, 1300, some changes occurred in the northwestern part of the state.
That one seems to be
And-
climate. And
And people leave.
people leave, they move to the Rio Grande Valley. Chaco is reoccupied by people that moved from Mesa Verde. Now, why they left Mesa Verde is something else again, Mesa Verde being in southwest Colorado.
Wetter there, one would think. Right?
One would think, but then they abandoned, finally, for the last time, Chaco Canyon, and people moved all over the Southwest at that point. And this again is a whole other topic of study about why people moved around the way they did, and where did they go, and what happened once they were assimilated. People went a long way, and they did not necessarily stay within language groups. You've got the Hopi Tewa still in Hopi.
Who are they?
Well, the Tewa speakers are generally from mid-north New Mexico. This is what used to be known as San Juan Pueblo, which is now Okeowinge. It's Santa Clara Pueblo, several other pueblos in the area. They are all Tewa speakers. It's a language group.
Different language.
Different language group. But during the Pueblo Revolt, some of them went to Hopi and stayed there.
Changed languages.
No, they continue to speak Tewa.
Spoke to.
But they're completely unintelligible, mutually unintelligible. It's as if you and I were to go to Germany. Although we have language, there's a link linguistically. Let's say we went to Saudi Arabia,
Yeah, right, of course.
and the Saudi Arabians took us in. We're not able to talk to each other,
Right.
and our cultures are real dissimilar. Now, the culture back then between the Hopi and the Tewa were way more similar. They lived in pueblos, they farmed the same crops, they had pottery and things like this. So, but the linguistic affiliation is simply not there.
Hmm.
So, that's not the only instance, but it's the one that comes to
Hmm.
mind. So, the Hopi Tewa are a group of people who still live at Hopi, or they may live in San Juan, but they have now cultural and family ties with Hopi. And it's just one of these
That's
weird
fascinating.
things. Yes, and so this is one of the things that's studied. But basically, folks left to live along the Rio Grande and the big pueblos there, because farming was easier and
Water.
water was there
obviously
right
been
along the Rio
constant.
Grande. But back to the ancestral people, one of the things that really is a hallmark now that we know now of their agriculture is that they had domesticated cotton prior to Columbus and prior to the Spanish coming here.
Native cotton.
Yes.
It wasn't imported.
Not really. Cotton is originally a perennial plant. You do not get a crop the same year you plant this. And it came from Mesoamerica, from Mexico, as a tropical plant. And it was traded into the Southwest because it also grew in brown as well as white cotton. I happen to have some here that I spin when I'm on a long, boring phone call.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And that's naturally brown cotton. And it's
Oh,
from
my word.
the cultivar that's still a perennial that you can get that grows in Mexico. So here is the yarn.
That is
It's
just
a fairly
wonderful.
fine yarn
Yeah, yeah.
that would have been used to weave garments. As near as I can tell, the Hohokam people at the southern part of Arizona, these are the folks that made the great canal system that is so famous in southeastern Arizona, that existed before the Spanish. They further domesticated this cotton, changing it from a perennial plant to an annual plant that would give you a crop the same year you planted.
That's an achievement. Selective breeding.
Selective breeding, it took more than one human generation to do it. This is not an accident, it is not a minor accomplishment. With my botany degree, I can tell you that this is a major accomplishment that
super
people
major.
have trouble understanding.
And passing along the knowledge is also important.
Basically, this group of people took it upon themselves, because they were already smart farmers, they took it upon themselves, knowing that they could do it, to change perennial cotton to an annual cotton. They did it and started growing annual cotton then in Arizona. It was picked up by the Hopi, who further selected this cotton to be a short growing season. They came up with a variety of cotton that went from seed to boll in 90 days.
Oh, my word.
You can't do that today.
That's...
And so it was this cotton then that was imported as a crop, as well as a fiber, into northern New Mexico. And this is one of my big achievements as an archaeobotanist, was to identify the first pollen evidence of cotton agriculture, cotton farming.
When did it happen?
I made this discovery in the 1989, 1990.
Spectacular.
From the area around Abiquiu, about an hour north of Santa Fe. And
How'd you figure it out? From
dirt they sent me from a
the
field.
dirt that you processed?
Yes, from a field system.
Well, dirt isn't just dirt.
Dirt is not just dirt. And I identified the cotton pollen grain as a very distinctive pollen grain.
What date? The
1250,
1250.
1300, all the way up to 1500 AD.
Way before European contact.
Oh, yes. And it had been abandoned. This is found at high elevation, 6,400 feet above sea level. And it's used as, the cotton pollen that I'm identifying, and other colleagues are now identifying, is in association with a particular farming technique that uses rocks to help grow crops. What happens is, these are grown at 6,400 feet, which is pretty high, and these are above any of the rivers that could have been used to irrigate these crops. So what was done was to slightly, but very sophisticatedly, modify the landscape to channel whatever water there is. What comes out of the sky is rain, what comes out of the sky in the winter is snow, and what condenses on rocks in the evening as dew. Then to channel all of that into dirt, under a rock mulch, and bound by a cobble border, as places then to grow crops.
That's fantastic.
It's amazing. The archaeological sites that are associated with this technique are almost all associated with the ancestral Tewa speaking archaeological sites. And so I and other archaeologists are looking at this gravel mulch farming technique as something that the Tewa people invented. And it comes from nowhere.
Right there.
Right there. And it has no other antecedents or descendants in anywhere in New Mexico or the greater Southwest.
So it could have been the product of one Tewa genius.
One Tewa group, yes. Absolutely. And it's a technique that's shared among Tewa speakers, as evidenced by the archaeological sites. So basically,
So it's spread by people who spoke the same
It spoke the
language, who had
language.
the same knowledge
Yep.
base.
Yep. It's just something that,
And they didn't share. It was patented, kind of.
well, kind of. I understand that there's one archaeological site with grid features, these gravel mulch grid features that are not Tewa speakers. So perhaps it married out. But by and large, the sites that we know of that are producing cotton anyway are Tewa. And so this just want to say, this cotton, this Aboriginal cotton, the seeds of this can still be bought today from Native Seed Search in Tucson, Arizona,
It's
because
fascinating.
horticulturalists at the turn of the 20th century happened to find some Indians, actually at Hopi, still growing this cotton.
This ancient plant.
It's a very ancient plant. And they tried to upgrade it because it has very short fibers. The thing they liked about that cotton was not only it grew from seed to boll in 90 days, but the cotton doesn't stick to the seed. You don't need a gin to get this fiber off the seed. And I wrote an article one time for a spinning magazine about what would slavery have been.
Well,
would we have slavery? Would
yeah,
we
that's
have
right.
had slavery if we'd known about Anasazi cotton,
That's right.
ancestral Puebloan cotton?
Instead of Eli Whitney.
Whitney and
cotton
all the
gin.
rest of that. You know, that he invented the cotton gin because the slaves were too slow at picking
That's right.
the seeds out
But
of the
then
cotton.
they could spend more time picking cotton, so you needed more people. to
That's
pick
right.
cotton.
You know, things I think would have been
Slavery
very
could have
different.
ended earlier, actually.
Would have been very different if we had known about ancestral Puebloan cotton.
Is this still grown now?
This brown cotton?
Agriculturally, as a crop?
As a crop, no,
It's not.
no. Because of historic events, the cotton of commerce is wedded, absolutely
I mean, it's
irrevocably.
brown. You don't have to dye it or anything. You can make some
Well,
awfully
okay,
nice brown.
we're talking two stories here. Let's talk about the cotton that is made in the clothing that you and I are wearing.
Right.
This comes from a kind of cotton that does stick to the seed. It's the cotton that was being farmed in slavery days. It's the cotton that's been accepted throughout most of the rest of the world as the cotton to grow because it grows to a certain, it's been genetically modified to grow to a certain height that's the proper height for the machines to pick. All the bowls open at the same time, so you get your maximum crop the one time you run the machine through there. It's of a certain length that the machines that spin the cotton have been designed to handle.
Yeah.
And it has certain known properties for dye uptake and washability and shrinkage and all this other
Engineered
stuff.
crop.
It's an engineered crop 100%. So no, they're not going to change from that. This brown cotton is a perennial and again can only be grown in certain places where you can afford to wait until year 2 for it to even flower and give you a crop. Well, that's not very many places.
That's not terribly
Peru is one of the places. There are 4 great centers of domestication of cotton around the world. India and Africa,
That's what's fascinating. Yeah,
and then
India-
Mesoamerica, and then Peru.
Yeah.
Each of those 4 places is a different species of the same genus, and the species don't cross. And they were all growing in these places prior to the breakup of Pangea, you know, and all
So this is an ancient plant.
very ancient plant,
So it's
the ancestor of this plant.
Triassic or Jurassic or
Exactly so.
Pangea breaks up.
Right. So when all the continents are still glued together, you've got cotton growing in
Yeah.
enough places so that when the continents break apart, you have cotton growing in India, you have cotton growing in what becomes
That's
Africa,
fantastic.
you have cotton growing in what becomes Mesoamerica.
This
and
is a
cotton
plant that
becomes-
the dinosaurs were probably eating.
Could well have been. And it's
It was
interesting,
around.
the ancestral plant grew on the seashores of the ocean. It's salt tolerant. And if you think of cotton today, you know, it's real finicky. It's got to have water, it's got to have fertilizer, it's got to have herbicides to kill off the weeds, it's got to have pesticides to kill off the things that eat it. And then, you know, there's just all kinds of problems with growing the cotton of commerce. But the ancestor
So
of cotton was way tolerant of conditions. And so these more, quote, primitive cottons like this perennial brown retain those characteristics, as did the cotton that the ancestral Puebloan people grew. And so this allowed the farming of cotton to happen in these places where you can't grow anything today.
Does it brown cotton only grow here?
The
Or
brown,
does
the
it
brown
grow
cotton
everywhere?
grows in Mexico,
Mexico. Yeah, right.
and then
But
in
New
Peru,
World.
New World. As far as I know. Now in Peru, the cotton grew, and perennial cotton again, in many colors. It grows in chocolate, and I mean chocolate color, all kinds of reds and browns. It comes up occasionally in pinks. And when the Spanish first came into Peru and were describing the cotton fields, they said they have cotton that grows in the colors of the rainbow plus a spotted one that is black and yellow. And they said they must have dyed these and then put them back on the
Put it
plant,
back in plant.
put them on the back of the plant to dry. because they had never seen
Yeah,
cotton in
yeah,
color, and they
cotton
couldn't
should be
believe.
white.
Well, and that's it. You know, this is one of those things you cannot believe the evidence of your eyes, so you make up a story that matches with what you know. And this is just throughout ethnographies in the Spanish Chronicles as well as everybody else's, because you can't have colored cotton. It doesn't grow in
It doesn't
colors.
make sense.
Doesn't make sense.
This
So-
cotton was used for clothing?
Yes. So, the ancestral Puebloans, we have some textiles that come from the 1300s that are woven completely of cotton.
Still
because
preserved.
Still preserved, because we didn't get wool until the Spanish brought them in the 16th
Right,
century
sheep,
from
right.
sheep. So if it wasn't dog hair, and if it wasn't buckskin, or it wasn't some other sort of plant fiber, then it was cotton. And the people were wearing so much cotton, or so many people were wearing cotton, when the Spanish came up the Rio Grande into New Mexico in the late 1500s, they saw that these Indians were civilized because they were wearing cotton garments just like the Spanish were, and they lived in villages with
Yeah,
multi-stories just like the Spanish did. And so that's where they came upon viewing these people. Oh, plus the Pueblo people in the Albuquerque area were using lead to paint designs on their pottery.
Metal use.
And you have to mine lead and you have to smelt lead to get this paint. And, and so that's why the Spanish really concentrated on the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico.
They're doing
because
lead,
these
they
guys
must
were
be
already-
doing gold. Where's the city of gold?
Well, all of that, because these Indians were, civilized. They were swivelized just like the Spanish, and they could relate to them as intelligent people. And so the poor Pueblo people came in for the brunt of the Spanish occupation because they had unfortunately advanced to degrees that the Spanish recognized as being valuable.
That's
So,
fascinating.
but back in the 1300s and the 1400s, when people were growing cotton up in these high elevation fields without irrigation and without extra water, they were weaving these cotton textiles, and they had what I call fancy duds. They had fancy clothes. Most of these textile remnants come from Arizona because better preservation there.
Yeah, drier climate.
Drier,
Cave sites.
the cave sites, exactly. There's no reason to believe that the ancestral Puebloan people here in northern New Mexico were not also wearing those same clothing, since we have very few fragments that would support that. And now we know that they grew some cotton here, but they probably did import the majority of cotton fiber from Hopi land, because Hopi was like the American South in the in prehistoric times, in pre-Columbian times. They grew extra cotton and traded it everywhere. So, people were wearing lace. They were wearing colored cottons that were woven in patterns that we still weave today as modern people. They were wearing belts and leggings and mantas and carrying baskets and having other clothing items and stuff that would be considered fancy and like haute couture wear, fashion today. And that these are people that
Sort
were
of comparable to Europe at the time.
absolutely. It's the lace in particular that is of great interest. There's a complicated weaving technique that's called sprang, S-P-R-A-N-G. It was independently invented in Europe and in the American Southwest.
How's it done?
It's weaving without a weft, and it's not braiding either. But basically, if I could have that black book on the edge of the bookcase there, yes, thank you, that one. The shirt on the front of this book is done in sprang
Oh my
technique.
word.
And the way this shirt
Can you
works,
get that? Look at that. It's just, yeah.
this is the neckline,
Yeah.
this is the shoulder, it's a sleeveless garment, and what looks like a ratty edge is actually the ending points that are braided from the manufacture, the creation of this complicated and asymmetrical, non-repeating design.
Oh, it's fantastic, isn't it?
This was a man's shirt,
Oh, this is fantastic.
and fragments of other shirts of similar manufacture
How old
of
is this?
all sizes.
The
It
shirt?
comes from the 1300s
1300.
AD. And obviously that's not the work of someone just learning this technique. This is a technique that's been around for a while because that's the work of a master. And I've seen the shirt. It has a back as well. It's just photographed there as if it were only showing the front, and the back is not the same as the front.
Mm.
And it fits a grown man. So it's worn. It has lost pieces of itself.
Is it every day special?
As near as we can tell, this
So
is
you
everyday
had
wear.
somebody, not necessarily the man who wore it, making it for himself.
Mhm.
Somebody who had the skill to make it then trades the product or gives it, sells it.
And this is where we come up with ideas about social organization in
Yeah.
the past. Because this is not a technique that can be picked up just overnight by any given
By
person.
anybody.
Then a person must dedicate their life to this learning and then practice.
Teaching an apprenticeship or something.
Exactly, which means then that somebody else is growing the crops that person is eating.
Yeah, you gotta have somebody producing the crop to
Exactly.
give to the person who's creating the product,
Exactly.
who's teaching other people about the product, and then
Mhm.
selling it or marketing it.
Marketing it, exactly, and it means then that this person's work, or the perpetuation of this work is important enough that they can miss this person's labor in the field and afford to dedicate somebody else to
Yeah, because you
supporting
can't
this
be out
person.
there picking crops if you're doing this.
No,
That's fascinating.
this is one of the most amazing textiles I know of in pre-Columbian times. There are others. Mantas are large cotton wearing blankets. They're about 5 feet by 5 feet on the side, and they're
Those
woven.
are-
They're big, and they're a cloak. It's your garment for sleeping in. It's a show off if it's colored in colors, because cotton is a very difficult fiber to make except a dye. You have cotton clothing fading even today. We've got
Yeah.
pretty advanced technology, but we
Where
can't.
did they get the colors from?
This is,
Vegetables or fruits or?
they would have had to get it from plant sources, also from mineral sources. And also in about the 1300s, the wearing blankets, they're called mantas, are also known as Anasazi striped blankets. And I've seen fragments of these. They are striped in red, black, yellow, and white. And I'm very interested in knowing how they got those colors to stick to cotton through centuries, especially after having been worn and washed in life, probably having been underground, either in a burial or buried in a site, then dug up, washed, God knows how, put on display, sold, displayed,
Didn't
sold,
oxidize or
displayed,
anything, didn't change.
displayed in museums, and now put away properly in drawers in the dark, but still with bright colors. Some of these undoubtedly are minerals, but not all of them are. I've looked at them microscopically. And so it is a particular research interest of mine to try to understand how they were able to color cotton fiber back then with permanent colors. And this has involved my learning about spinning and weaving and dyeing. All of the recipes that have come to us from the past some of them are good on cotton, the majority of them are good on wool.
Where do they come from, the recipes? Are
They come from the
written
Hopi and
down,
the
or-
Navajo people, from ethnographies.
So they're oral, told to people who write
Yes.
them down?
And these oral ethnographies date to the 1850s and
Anything
forward.
from the conquistadors about how they did it?
Not particularly, no.
Because it didn't particularly interest them?
Well, no, it did interest them, but bear in mind that when the Spanish came, they were a global power. They
Yeah.
were like, one of the major
Right.
powers in the entire
Right.
world. And they were able to bring dyestuffs from Indonesia, from Africa, from the Middle East, from all over the place to New Mexico. And these dyestuffs were completely unknown to the native people here, obviously, but they were also designed for wool and for protein fibers like silk. They weren't designed for cotton. And so when the native people picked up wool, and they abandoned cotton pretty quickly. Cotton is a short fiber, it's tedious to spin, it takes a long time to grow enough, to get enough to make a garment from. Wool is long, the animal produces it every year,
Right.
and besides, the Spanish really preferred wool. All the dyes worked on wool, so they pretty much abandoned both cotton agriculture and the dyes that were good on cotton. So those recipes were lost. And the recipes I've been able to find and play with are not permanent on cotton, so we've lost something major here. And it's something that
Where
it's a
can we
research interest.
find seeds for that brown cotton again?
This one
If
you
you're
can also
interested
get
in?
from Native Seed Search in Tucson, Arizona. Now the species they will sell you comes from Peru, and it will take a good 2 years, I've grown it, for that plant to even flower. And then it's picky about how old it has to be before it'll give you a crop. It'll wait until it's 4 or 5 years old to give you a brown cotton fiber.
Is anyone collecting seeds from New Mexico?
We don't have this colored cotton in New Mexico. All we
Okay.
have is the white cotton, and Seed Search does sell that white cotton as
Okay.
well. Now that one's called Aboriginal Sacaton. It has all the characteristics that we see from cotton plants and seed and fiber that come from archaeological sites both in New Mexico and Arizona. What happened there is that by the time the agricultural researchers and the horticulturalists got to southern Arizona to see that some Indians were growing that cotton in their little backyard plots, that one had long enough fiber that they weren't interested in crossing that with anything. And it didn't grow. It grows in 120 days, 150 days. And so they just sort of left that cotton alone.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you grow that, it takes that little longer time period, but then the fiber still does wipe off the seed. And in that regard, it is exactly like the cotton that we find in the agricultural sites, or the archaeological sites. That one only grows in white. This brown that I grew comes from Mexico, and I got it from a business in Arizona called Spin and Weave. Spin and Weave, also in Tucson. I don't know if they're still in business. It's harder to get the seeds for this brown one. I grew it a bunch
That's fascinating.
in my windowsills in my other office
Yeah.
before I moved, and I personally do have some seeds for that and would be happy to share them. It produces bulbs and fiber in the second year on. That plant doesn't like, none of these perennials like to be pruned, and to keep it in the window, I had to prune it back, and so after about age 5, it gave up on me and just croaked.
Is it a large plant or?
It wants to be big, and I'm unable to give it more than about this much growing room on my windowsill.
Let's see. Getting back now to
Yes.
what you do and why. Well, the title of state archaeologist,
Archaeologist.
is very impressive.
Thank you. It is impressive.
Obviously filled by an impressive person.
Well, thank you very much. I never thought I would be a state archaeologist. It is that big and important an office. People look at you as the person in the know about everything.
You're expected to
You're
know.
expected
You
to
are
know
the
it all.
state archaeologist.
The state archaeologist. A lot of people think that I'm in charge of archaeology throughout the state, and I'm not. What I do, archaeology on state and private land is protected by law. And to do archaeology on
Which law?
well, there's a state law. It's the cultural property that requires state agencies to, quote, exercise due caution to avoid inadvertent damage to cultural resources on state land. It's a big charge. About 30% of New Mexico is one kind of state land or another. So, and that includes municipalities and cities. It includes the highway department. It includes the state land office. It includes lots of people. So what this means is that anytime Santa Fe wants to put in a new street, that's considered
Or
state
road.
land, or repave, or service a
Or
sewer
tunnel
line.
or anything, built somewhere.
All of those places are considered state land, and so they have to exercise due caution to avoid inadvertent damage.
How do they do that?
They do a survey.
They call you.
I work with people they call. They have to do an archaeological evaluation of the place where the project is going to
What does that mean?
happen. It means checking with our archives. We have an archives that covers all archaeological sites that are known in the state. We're over 150,000 known archaeological sites in the state.
150,000 occurrences.
And we add about 5,000 more every year, largely as the result of these public works projects that happen around the states.
Are these on a computer based now?
Yes, they are. And these data are available to those with a need to know. So people always accuse archaeologists of locking up all this data and they won't share with people and all this other stuff. Well, one of the big missions of the Historic Preservation Division, where I work, is working with communities and agencies in planning their public works projects. And one of those is to find out, well, do we already know something about this area? And if so, what do we know? And therefore, what might we be encountering when we undertake this public works project? So looking at the archives is very, very important. In a sense, well, a lot of people think that old data are of no use whatsoever. You've got to have the latest data. And in fact, the oldest data is the most important for this field, because people were able to go on private land in places then that they're not allowed to go to today.
Right.
And so we depend a lot on our archives. And it's one of the best archive systems in the country. A lot of states confer with us and contract with that part of this division to try and set up archives that are as useful as ours are for planning purposes. So it's a big deal. New Mexico's lucky in that regard. So, where were we?
You were telling us what you do and why.
What do I do at night? Oh yeah, on state
How were
land.
you picked? How is someone chosen as the state, is there a, job ad
Yes, I
that
was.
occurs in a journal or newspapers? Or?
Mm-hmm. I was the last person standing.
Survivor.
Yeah, I've held this job for 9 years. It'll be 10 years next October, in '07.
How many, and there have been state archaeologists since 1969 or earlier?
Yes.
Since the job was created?
Well, it was certainly codified in law at that time.
Okay.
There were probably informal state archaeologists before then. A lot of the organization of state offices around the country, preservation offices, come from the National Historic Preservation Act that was passed in 1966.
It's a federal act.
Federal Act. And that one sets up offices of historic preservation in each state, and each one is, if not headed, at least employs a state historic preservation officer. Commonly, part of that officer's staff is a state archaeologist. So I don't have 49 counterparts. I think one state finally didn't see the purpose in their state archaeologist, so I might have 48 compatriots. But nonetheless, the majority of the states and territories and protectorates have some sort of top archaeologist. And the range of us have different duties. Many of us actually consult with tribes on disposition of articles under the federal act known as NAGPRO, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation
What does
Act.
that do?
That repatriates human remains and museum objects to tribes from which they were taken. If that tribe can, if they wanted those items back, and many tribes don't want them back, and if that tribe can prove that they're actually culturally affiliated to those items. And in many states, not New Mexico, but in many states that's a contentious relationship. We're very fortunate in New Mexico that people respect each other, and we have friendly relationships pretty much with everybody. But I do not do repatriation. State archaeologists in other states are heads of museums. I'm not the museum head. Other ones will do private research. They will go out and excavate sites and do research. I said private, but it's actually state-sponsored research, and advance our knowledge about certain parts of the state and certain time periods. I don't get to do that. What I do get to do is a lot of public outreach. I do a lot of public speaking. I consult with communities on their desires for public outreach or for preservation. They want to know what's in it for us, if we want to set aside a building or an archaeological site for the future. And I'll talk to them about tax incentives, tourism opportunities. I work with schools on curricula, on how to get people to understand that archaeology is not just a place to get arrowheads and artifacts to put on your shelf, but rather these are the remains of people that have come before. And while they may not be your particular ancestor or my particular ancestor, we are all human beings, and they are all our human ancestors. And besides, archaeology is not just about Indian sites, it's about Mormon sites, it's about bean farmers, it's about early industry, it's about
So it's got a
everybody.
historical component.
Absolutely. Archaeology starts yesterday. And under the National Historic Preservation Act, a threshold was set at 50 years before any given archaeological site can be considered potentially eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places.
What is that, National Register?
Oh, it's the honor roll for the most important sites and places in American history.
Who chooses these places and how?
They're inducted into the honor roll by a person who's known as the keeper of the National Register in Washington, D.C. He works for the National Park Service. I worked for the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. for a short stint in my checkered past, and I actually knew that person, and it's a very august position. You talk about a position with an impressive title, to be the keeper and the person who makes the decision as to whether this is of national significance or not is a pretty big job. We have a number, I don't know how many hundred historic buildings and archaeological sites in New Mexico listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but we have a lot. We also have.
Why are they important to pay attention to?
Why?
These places. Why not just tear them down and put up a new house or skyscraper or
you probably know
parking lot?
From your dealings with younger people as well as people our old age and older, people relate to the past through tangible remains. To talk about the Civil War is one thing. And to watch it on television and in movies is another thing, and visiting the grave of a Civil War soldier is yet again something. But to visit the fort where the battles actually happened, or to hold a button, and as I was saying, with Civil War battle, if a person can even visit the fort where the battle was fought, then you begin to understand why the battle went the way you read that it did, or why the fort was put where it was and the battle came to that location. But if you can actually hold a bullet or hold a button, hold something from that period.
Walk where these people walked.
Well, yes, you begin to say, wow, these really were people in the sense that my parents are people or my grandparents are people, the way I'm a person. And you begin to understand the past as not something that is different from you because people were primitive or stupid, but because technology was at the level that it was, and people were playing out the same passions that we do today and the same needs that we have today for food and shelter and clothing, but with different means. When you don't have metal, you use stone. When you don't have iron, you use copper. When you don't have this, that, and the other, you use what you have.
I remember a trip to Lincoln, the town where
Yes,
Billy
the Kid.
who was one of our most infamous heroes.
Yes.
But I think that whole town is on the register.
Really
almost all
close.
of it.
It's certainly, I believe, on the state register. Now, see, this is something else with the legislation at the federal level. The federal government recognized that maybe some places in the states, any state, might not rise to the level of national significance, but certainly they rise to the level of state significance in that state's history. And so it encourages the listing of historic properties on a state register of historic places. And in New Mexico, that is the State Register of Cultural Properties. We have 1,800 properties in the state of New Mexico that are listed either on the National Register, the State Register, or both. And they range pretty evenly between archaeological sites and buildings, or districts of buildings in small towns, like Las Vegas. You go to downtown Las Vegas, most every building you see there is listed on the state or national
Victorian
register.
ones are just spectacular.
Exactly. And because Las Vegas, in its place in New Mexico history, was the terminus for the railroad changed everything in New Mexico.
Had the first opera.
And Las Vegas citizens, in their wisdom, recognized that marking that turning point in the history of the state of New Mexico could be accomplished by saving those buildings and saving that commercial district and then saving the residential areas for the people who lived around the commercial district or had business with the commercial district. And so what you have now is a charming town that truly captures a moment in time. But it takes foresight on the parts of the citizens to do this, because preservation law on both the state and federal level are written from the ground up. Government cannot tell private citizens to preserve something.
To do with their property.
What it does is provide opportunities and incentives for those private citizens to help preserve our collective past if they feel like it. And as an archaeologist, it's very frustrating to me that the "if you feel like it" part, because so much archaeology in New Mexico is involved with pottery or with other kinds of archaeological artifacts that are considered very valuable.
They have economic value on the market, but are they legal to market
overseas?
if
Yes.
they're from a private land?
Yes and no. And this is the bane of my existence. New Mexico law and federal law generally recognizes that land belongs to the landowner. And with very few exceptions, government cannot tell the landowner what to do with that land. Those few exceptions have to do with public health, by and large. You can't put a nuclear waste dump on your private land.
I wanted to.
I know you did, but you can't open a coal mine on your private land without a federal permit. And that federal permit has all kinds of hoops and things that it makes you go through in the name of public health and safety. And you can't do this and you can't do that on your private land, but you can do lots of other things on your private land. And digging up and destroying an archaeological site on your private land is one of the things that you are allowed to do. In New Mexico, the only thing you cannot do on an archaeological site on your private land is disturb a burial. New Mexico enacted Burial Protection Law in 1989, which is late in human history, but at least we have one. And it is a felony for you, the landowner, or a state agency, to knowingly, willingly, and intentionally disturb, destroy, excavate, or remove an unmarked human burial or anything in the ground with that burial. This was passed in order to stop the rampant destruction of burials in the southwestern part of the state for Membrey's bowls.
Looking for pots
Looking for pottery. These are specific kinds of bowls.
of high economic value on the marketplace, or as collector's items.
Collector's items. You'll recognize these instantly. These are the bowls with the pictures of the animals
They're
and
spectacular.
and the things in them. They are spectacular for any number of reasons, only one of which is art. And actually that's the lesser part of it in the way I look at things. These almost 100% come from burials. And so the people...
They were the grave goods that
Yes.
were...
And so the people who dug these and the people that bought them are grave robbers. They're looters. And it was enough of a problem that the New Mexico legislature finally recognized that it was wrong, even on private land, that it was wrong. And so they passed this burial act that makes it a felony even for a landowner to dig a burial in order to recover anything from it. And unfortunately, the looting still goes on, but at least it's on a way lower level, and they have to try to practice it in secret because people know it's a felony. Now in Texas, right next door, it's still legal to loot Indian graves because no one's ever been able to convince the Texas legislature to protect the Indian dead like we do the non-Indian dead.
Hmm.
And this is one of the great injustices of people against people in my book that is still practiced. And I was the assistant state archaeologist in Texas for 4 years, and I worked on that very law. And even in the 20 years I've been gone, they've still been unable to convince the legislature to infringe upon private landowners' rights.
So it'd be almost impossible for anyone to collect bowls without disturbing a gravesite.
That's correct.
Because they go hand in hand.
That's correct. And to be able to excavate that bowl and sell it legally, you have to have a permit. And I'm one of the signers of that permit. So this is how I
Someone
get...
would want to, but someone would not be able to come to you to say that I just dug up a bowl, I didn't see a body, I want a permit to sell it. They're more apt to say, my uncle gave it to me, or I found it on the highway.
Yeah.
How would they apply for a permit?
Well, see, the permit is for the actual excavation of the burial itself. So they wouldn't
So
come
they
to me
apply
once
for a
they...
permit, for an archaeological dig permit
Yes.
to excavate a burial.
Mhm.
And the pottery is incidental, but
Mhm.
that's what they're actually after.
Correct. The law specifically protects anything in the burial with the human remains. Let's take another kind of burial. Let's take a Civil War burial. Let's take a Buffalo Soldier burial.
Right.
I hear stories of people digging up those graves in order to get the buttons, but to take the skulls.
Yeah.
And people are very put out at me when they call and want to know if they can have the skull from this burial that just got exposed in an arroyo. And I say no. And they say, well, why not? You know, the person's dead. They're not going to miss
They
their
don't
skull. And it's like, no, you can't have the skull, and no, you
It
can't
would
have
be
this.
different if it was their aunt or their uncle or their
Actually,
parent.
these days,
You
no,
think?
it doesn't
You
matter.
think not?
When I was coming up, yes, that would have mattered. But people are so crass these days, and eBay has so corrupted everyone's sense of propriety.
eBay's a shocker.
It is a shocker. They still sell human remains on
I know,
eBay.
I know.
What they've been impressed with is the need to not sell human remains that are not associated with medical purposes. And so now every ad you see for human remains has in there somewhere that this is for medical research only. At the
Well-
same time that they identify it as a World War II German soldier skull, or a Hawaiian king,
know,
or an
I know.
Anasazi skull, or whatever.
Or a dinosaur egg from China,
Those two.
which are on eBay.
Right. So increasingly what I do is work with law enforcement
So you,
and with
do
tribes.
you actually police eBay? Or
I don't
are
have
there
time to.
staff people to do it?
I have no staff.
Have
I'm
you
it.
thought about volunteers?
I am
Doing that
the
for
office
the-
of the state archaeologist. What I do is I have friends on the outside that will alert me when something truly egregious comes on eBay. But, no, I don't have time to monitor eBay, there's way too much to do.
Is there a lot of illegal trafficking in artifacts and anthropological remains here in the state?
Yes.
In the shopping malls where you see Indian goods